Okay, I hope it's fine. Yeah, it is fine. Okay, so I'm still dancing, but I think it's not going to be a problem. Let me go through the presentation with the dancing move. I'm Marta Kowal, and I'm a PhD student at the Institute of Psychology, University of Wrocław, Poland. I really hope that by the end of this year, I will defend my PhD thesis, but we'll see about that. And today I have the pleasure to talk about one of our studies. Love predicts affective touch toward romantic partners worldwide. So let's start. Um, okay. We all probably know that touch is important. Touching behaviors contribute to a lower stress responses. Touching reduces heart rate, blood pressure. It also decreases the cortisol level, and also touching can alleviate pain. On the other hand, when we are deprived of touch, there might be symptoms of depression and anxiety and somatization. And we also know that touch is even more important in the romantic context because touching is a primary way to communicate our intimacy towards our romantic partners. Also, from what we know from previous studies, affective touch within a romantic context is something that is observed all around the world. And partners, unsurprisingly, are allowed to touch more body parts than other people, including also family members. And this might relate to abdomen or thighs. We're pretty okay with our partners touching us in those areas, and also some sexual aspects as well. So the previous studies also showed that the degree of physical affection correlates positively with relationship satisfaction and partner satisfaction. So considering that touch is so prevalent and so important, the question remains, is touch related to love experiences? And this, when I heard for the first time, when I thought about this question for the first time, I thought that, yeah, it's obvious that it should be related to love experiences. But surprisingly, only one study tackled this issue. And this study was from 1994, so almost 30 years ago. And Dighton and colleagues actually conducted it and among 200 married couples. And the authors showed that physical affection, including touching behaviors, but not only, performed by a romantic partner was positively related with self assessed love. So we aim to empirically verify it. And first of all, I got to thank to all the team members who made that study possible. Here you can see all the names. And the PI of that project, because this is data coming from around 4 years ago, was led by Agnieszka Sorokowska and Piotr Sorokowski. Piotr Sorokowski is also my supervisor. And if he ever watches this video, hi, Piotr. Okay, so in trying to find a answer to this question, we focus on the theory of Sternberg, which is triangular love theory. You probably heard of it all, but let's just review it quickly. So Sternberg assumed that love comprises of three components, and this is intimacy, passion, and commitment. Intimacy is associated with close, intimate, and special bond and trusting between partners. Passion often relates to sexual desire, physical arousal, and such aspects within a relationship. And commitment is considered the coldest aspect of love, which is basically involvement and decision to be involved and committed to a romantic partner. So we conducted two studies. First study was based on the analysis of data from previous global survey, and the total number of participants was above 11,000, but we mainly took into consideration only those who responded to all the questions and who were in committed relationships. So all in all, we analyzed data of 9,681 individuals from 37 countries. And we measured a lot of things, but for the sake of the time, I'm going to briefly talk about two measures, which is love and touch. How we measured love? Well, we used STLS. This is a triangular love scale comprising of 45 items. And 15 items of this scale measure intimacy, another 15 passion, and 15 commitment. Intimacy, or an exemplary item, reads, I feel that my partner really understands me. Passion, my relationship with my partner is passionate. And commitment, I view my relationship with my partner as permanent. And the scale ranged from one, not at all, to extremely, if someone fully agreed with this item. And regarding the touch, we computed partner effective touch variability index, and we asked our participants 4 questions. Have you touched your partner in this way within the last week? Embrace, stroke, kiss, and hug. We provided each of those examples, visual examples for the participants. So we computed an index based on those 4 questions, and if someone answered yes to all 4 questions, then he scored maximally on this index. If someone, for instance, only kissed their partner within 1 week, so he only got 1 point. So let's go to the results. We run a multi-level analysis, and we control for many factors, as you can see. But once again, for the sake of the time, let's focus on love only. We did 5 steps in each model. We added a few things, but in each of those models, love significantly predicted the amount of touch. So the outcome variable was our touch index, and the predictor variable was love. But this study had one of the limitations, which is that we only asked a dichotomous question to our participants: have you touched in this way your partner? And in the second study, we thought that we can make this design even better, which is we dropped the dichotomous questions for the sake of frequency questions. So instead of variability index, we comprise partner effective touch frequency index. We collected data from 199 individuals in 2 waves. In the first wave, they were asked questions about love and touch, and in the second wave, a few days later, they were asked the same questions about touch, but not on love. This way, we could measure ICC, intra-class correlation coefficients, for our touch scale. And once again, we ask 4 questions, but this time, how many times have you touched your partner in this day, on a particular day? And how much time did you spend together with your partner? So this allowed us to compute a partner effective touch frequency index per hour for each participant. And the results, as you can see here from this nice looking graph, hopefully nice looking, kissing was the most prevalent behavior within a romantic context. And the second most frequent was hugging, then stroking, and the last one was embracing. Importantly, we did not find any differences in the amount of touching per hour between working days and weekends. We also control for that, but because there were no differences, we just treated them in the same way. So this time we computed only a simple linear regression model, and we controlled for several factors found significant in the previous study. Let's focus on love. And as you can see, love significantly predicted the amount of touch our participants perform within the romantic context. We also observed that older participants less frequently touch their partners, which is something that is not surprising based on the previous literature. So the conclusions, love, both in our large-scale study and in the second study, involving a little bit finer method to measure touch, love was a significant predictor of affective touch behaviors in romantic partnership. And also, regardless of the day, what I mentioned earlier, if it was a weekend or a working day, and controlling for other potentially influencing factors that might be related to touching behaviors, we still nonetheless found that affective touch was a relatively stable characteristic of romantic relationship that was strongly and reliably predicted by love for the partners. So the take-home message is that love for partners predicts the amount of affective touch. And I gotta say that the work from the study is currently under review in scientific reports. So if any of you are or will be our reviewers, please be gentle and don't hate us that much. Of course, I'm joking, hate us, so to make this study even better. and finer. Uh, Thank you for listening. Here are some contact information. If you want to collaborate in our future large scale studies, please let me know. We're always open to new collaborations, and we always like to meet new people who have the same interest as us. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'm free to answer them.
Thank you, Marta. That was really interesting. So if anyone's got any questions, they can come up to this lectern at the front right. I might start with a question. So love, you said the way you measured it was with the triangular love scale, which involves 3 subscales. Have you or do you intend on looking at each of the subscales and touch? And if so, do you have any ideas about which of the subscales might be most associated with touch or frequency of touch?
Sure. That's a really good question. In fact, we did analyze it. And what we found was because in those analyses I showed you, we only treated love as a mean of all 45 items. But as you said, there are 3 subscales of love within the triangular love scale. And we observed that intimacy and passion was related to touch, while commitment was not. So it's kind of obvious if we think about passion because it relates with physical affection, physical arousal. But interestingly, intimacy is often considered as this warm component of love, while commitment is the coldest component of love. So we actually found some evidence that, in fact, commitment might be the coldest component of love, which is not, at least in our studies, related to touching and the frequency of touching.
Well, if there's no other questions, we might get on to the next one. Thanks very much, Marta. Everybody give Marta a big round of applause.
Yay!
All right, thank you, Marta. All right, so I'm up next. I might try to share screen. All right, hopefully you can all see that. So g'day everyone, my name's Adam Bode and I'm a PhD student at the Australian National University, and the title of my talk today is A New Evolutionary Model Explains the Mechanisms of Romantic Love. So I'm going to introduce an evolutionary model of romantic love that's informed by the theory of co-opting mother-infant bonding, and which tells us about the mechanisms involved in romantic love. So I'll go through these mechanisms in more detail in the presentation, but just to introduce them now, the 5 mechanisms that I believe contribute to romantic love are mother-infant attraction, mother-infant attachment, preoccupation, courtship attraction, and sexual desire. So I'm going to start with introducing a number of concepts and definitions. And so I'm sorry, some of this might be a little bit dense, but it's necessary to make sense of the rest of the presentation. So I wasn't able to find a good biological definition of mother-infant bonding in humans, but there is a pretty decent psychological definition, which I think has some useful components. So Bicking, Kinsey, and Hupsey define mother-infant bonding, or maternal bonding as they call it, as a maternal-driven process that occurs primarily throughout the first year of a baby's life, although it may last longer. It's an affective state of the mother. Maternal feelings and emotions towards the infant are the primary indicator, and behavioural and biological indicators may promote maternal-infant bonding or be an outcome of maternal-infant bonding. So I think this is particularly useful because it does 2 things. It states that mother-infant bonding is maternal-driven, and it suggests that there's behavioural and biological factors associated with mother-infant bonding. So what are the mechanisms of mother-infant bonding? Mother-infant bonding, I had a look at the literature, and there appears to be 3 primary mechanisms. The first is a dopamine and oxytocin-rich attraction component, which would be associated with proximity seeking and attentional biases. And that's associated with activity in the left ventral tegmental area, right thalamus, left substantia nigra, and putamen. also appears to be a dopamine, oxytocin, and opioid-rich attachment component. That's most characterized by elevated rates of circulating oxytocin in early mothers. There's a third mechanism, which is a preoccupation component, and that's associated with obsessive thoughts about the infant. So what is romantic love? There's quite a number of definitions of romantic love, but I've chosen to go with a biological definition, which is that it's a motivational state typically associated with a desire for long-term mating with a particular individual. It occurs across the lifespan and is associated with distinctive cognitive, emotional, behavioral, social, genetic, neural, and endocrine activity in both sexes. Throughout much of the life course, it serves mate choice, courtship, sex, and pair bonding functions. It can best be described as a suite of adaptations and byproducts that arose sometime during the recent evolutionary history of humans. So when we're talking about the mechanisms of romantic love, there's been a lot of research over the last 20 or 25 years, but the predominant evolutionary theory that tells us about the mechanisms of romantic love is what I refer to as Fisher's theory of independent emotion systems. So it was published first in 1998, and it does tell us a bit about the mechanisms. The theory essentially says that there's three separate emotion systems evolved that play a role in mammalian reproduction. There's lust, or the sex drive, which is associated with androgens and estrogens and evolved to make us want to engage in sex generally. There's attraction, which Fisher equates to romantic love, associated with the catecholamines, phenylethylamine, and serotonin, and that evolved to focus our energies on preferred mating partners. And there's attachment associated with oxytocin and vasopressin, and that evolved to facilitate biparental care. So there's quite a number of problems with Fisher's model. It was developed prior to a single biological study on romantic love. It takes a very narrow definition of romantic love, focusing energies on a preferred mating partner, and it suggests that there's a single system responsible for everything that's involved in romantic love. And that's a bit of a black box approach, and we do know now that romantic love is far more complex than that. And there's been a lot of research since 1998 that hasn't really been incorporated into the model. What is co-option? Co-option is an evolutionary process essentially whereby a trait, such as a mechanism, morphology, behavior, or genes, are replicated in an innovated form to serve a different function. So it's somewhat similar to the concept of exaptation, which you may be familiar with, whereby a trait takes on a new function. Co-option differs in that the trait is replicated first in a different form to take on that new function. So the commonly cited example are the feathers of birds, which originally are believed to have played a role in thermoregulation, but were created in a slightly different manner to serve a function in flight. So what is the theory of co-opting mother-infant bonding? I've defined it as the fact that some of the cognitions, emotions, behaviors, neurobiology, neuroendocrinology, and genetics of mother-infant bonding were co-opted to form romantic love. The function changed from mother-infant bonding to pair bonding, but other mechanisms in psychology, specifically courtship, attraction, and sexual desire, may have also been recruited and modified. So now I'm going to talk to you about the evidence that these three components of mother-infant bonding were co-opted in romantic love. And so if you'll remember, the first mechanism was a mother-infant attraction, and that's associated with oxytocin and dopamine. There's two lines of evidence that support this strongly. The first is a meta-analysis of 3 types of love undertaken by Ortiz and colleagues in 2010, and they found that there's substantial overlap in regions rich in dopamine and oxytocin. There was a second meta-analysis undertaken very recently, the use an activation likelihood estimation method by Sheen and colleagues, and they found that activity in the left ventral tegmental area was common to both maternal love and romantic love, and they suggest that this indicates that there are shared evolutionary roots. The second mechanism is attachment, and as you'll recall, that's associated with dopamine, oxytocin, and opioids. And there's 3 lines of evidence supporting the co-option of attachment in romantic love from mother-infant bonding. The first is a seminal study by Bartels and Zecchi, which was an fMRI study of maternal love and romantic love. And they found activity in romantic love overlaps precisely with maternal love, particularly in regions rich in oxytocin and vasopressin receptors. So that includes regions like the striatum, middle insula, and dorsal part of the anterior cingulate cortex. There's also high levels of circulating oxytocin in mother-infant bonding and romantic love. This is particularly the case in the early stages of romantic relationships in new parents following gazing into their infant's eyes, in pregnancy, and following mother-child contact. There's also another line of evidence that has shown that there's higher circulating beta endorphin, which is an opioid, in early stage couples and new parents compared to singles. And the third mechanism of mother-infant bonding that I think was co-opted is a preoccupation component. So any mother would be able to recall this type of preoccupation, which are essentially obsessive thoughts about the infant. And so there's quite a lot of similarities between preoccupation in mother-infant bonding and romantic love. And some examples are having one's daily routine interrupted by thoughts about their infant or loved one, thoughts about their infant or loved one interfere with concentration on other things, visually imagining their infant, loved one when not in direct contact, and thinking about their infant or loved one when at work or otherwise engaged. So, as you recall, I suggested in the definition of the theory of co-opting mother-infant bonding that those three components were co-opted, but that two other components may have just been recruited and modified. So I'm going to talk about those two now. The first is the courtship attraction episode. So romantic love serves a mate choice and courtship function. Courtship, we all know what that is. It's pursuing a mate, wooing a mate, trying to demonstrate that you're of sufficient value that they want to be in a relationship with you. And we know from the Shi et al. Meta-analysis that there's bilateral activation in the ventral tegmental area, which is not the case in mother-infant bonding, which is left lateralized. So this could indicate that a courtship attraction component is bilateral and has been recruited and modified in romantic love. There's a few possible other explanations for this activity, but I think that's a good line of evidence. The final mechanism that I think was recruited and modified is sexual desire. So romantic love serves a sex function, and there's a number of neurobiological similarities between sexual desire and romantic love, particularly activity in the caudate, insular putamen, and anterior cingulate cortex. There's also increased testosterone in females experiencing romantic love, and increased testosterone is associated with increased perceptivity, which is a type of sexual desire associated with a motivation to initiate sexual activity. So in sum, I believe that three components of mother-infant bonding, attraction, attachment, and preoccupation, were co-opted to form romantic love, and a courtship, attraction, and sexual desire mechanism was recruited and modified. So in conclusion, I think that model is internally consistent. It's based on strong evolutionary theory, tells us a lot about the mechanisms of romantic love, and is a substantial improvement upon Fisher's model. Thank you. All right, thank you very much for that. If anybody has any questions, they can come up to the lectern and ask questions. Doesn't look like it's, we've got one question.
Oops. Hi, Adam. Once again, thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering how to verify the theory in future studies. How would you think that we might do it?
So there's a number of ways we can do that. So I think targeted fMRI and PET scans in particular are going to be particularly useful to isolate activation of specific neurotransmitter systems. So one way to do that would be to compare people in the early stages of romantic love with people who are potentially experiencing unrequited love. And that would, because there would be an assumption that unrequited lovers don't have much of an attachment system activated. But if we can demonstrate that there's an attachment system activated in romantic love, that would be some evidence. I think it would also be useful to have a meta-analysis looking at sexual desire and romantic love using advanced statistical techniques would be another method. But essentially, I've posted a preprint on the theory of co-opting mother-infant bonding, and I do outline a number of ways forward.
Thank you.
Very much. Now we've got Samuel Snowden. So Samuel, if you could come up to the orange circle and do your presentation. And just remember to talk a bit loudly. I think Samuel is having some issues with his microphone, so we'll all be listening attentively.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay. Can everyone see my PowerPoint okay? Okay. All right. Hello, my name is Samuel Snowden. I am currently an undergrad student at the University of Arkansas. I am also the lab manager for Dr. Mitch Brown in the Sphere Lab. I want to give a big thanks to Mr. Bode for inviting me to talk. I really appreciate that. Today I will be talking about functional reactions to romantic disclosures within a short-term mating context. Our challenge is that we are trying to select a committed mate while avoiding those who are merely faking commitment for the benefits of sex, pretty much. The solution to this, we found, is that romantic skepticism, which would impede the liking of a partner for romantic disclosure, which would prevent some of the potential costs that you could occur from falling in love with someone who says that they love you, even if it is not genuine. Two of these costs could be either infidelity or desertion from the relationship itself. This is actually especially important for women's decisions, as women would occur larger reproductive costs just from gestation. Research shows that, as seen by Professor Ackerman's work, skepticism should decrease as the commitment increases. So romantic behaviors in a one-night stand could be seen as either manipulative or a sign of just trying to catch feelings for that partner, which would impede their interest. My first hypothesis that we were testing is that we predicted that people would be more skeptical to romantic confession following a short-term mating experience, just a one-night stand, than a long-term mating experience, such as a committed relationship. Our second hypothesis is that given the reproductive asymmetries that women face, women's skepticism should be greater than men's to these displays. We had participants read 4 separate gender-neutral vignettes describing one of 2 different relationship contexts. 2 described a one-night stand scenario, and another 2 described a committed relationship of about 6 months. All vignettes described a scenario in which the participant had sex with the target the night before and then again the following morning. Importantly, targets were described as saying in the morning a control statement of they had a good time, and then our AV was that they were confessing their love to the participant following sex in the morning. For our results, for our trust outcome, we found that participants trusted the romantic confession and long-term relationships more than a one-night stands. For our skepticism outcome, we found that participants were more skeptical to romantic confession in a one-night stand. And for our interest outcome, we found that participants were more averse to further contact with the one-night stand who confessed love than in the long-term relationship itself. Here is a graphic representation of what we found. As you can see, we found those in the one-night stand condition had a higher aversion to someone who confessed their love compared to the control than those who were in a long-term committed relationship. For discussion, participants were more skeptical to the intentions of a one-night stand confessing love, which usually led to aversion. This is most likely to prevent emotional manipulation by that person. It means of just getting short-term sex without having any long-term consequences of it, and also facilitates dissolving other same short-term bonds. Unexpectedly, men and women had similar responses towards these displays. However, after further thought, this is sensible given women's concerns of resource diversion and men's concerns of cuckoldry, which would make skepticism beneficial to both of these groups. Future research would benefit from identifying specific affordances of individuals who confess love in one-night stands. These could be people who might already have a proclivity towards infidelity, or this could also depend on certain attachment styles. It could also be possible individual differences in situational factors foster less attention to the possible deception connected to these confessions, such as someone who is going through the process of ovulation, or someone who's already possessive in an anxious attachment style. Again, thank you for letting me talk in this symposium. This is actually one of the first talk I've given. So please bear with me as I gave that. I hope it went well. I also want to give a big shout out to Dr. Mitch Brown, who was responsible for all the research I've done, to me being here in the first place, and the members of my Sphere lab. Unfortunately, I will not be able to stick around for the end of the symposium as I have classes to go to, but please feel free to contact me through email, and any questions now I am open to. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. That was very interesting. Do we have any questions? Question, Sam. So could you give us examples of how people might convey a desire for long-term commitment after a one-night stand? Are they saying "I love you"? Are they saying specifically
we had them specifically say in the vignettes we had for control, we had them just say, "I had a good time with you last night." And then for the people who were trying to show that they were in a long-term committed relationship, even if they were not actually going to do that, we simply had them state, "I love you" to them following sex.
That simple.
Yeah. Are there any other questions that I could answer? No?
Thanks very much, Sam.
Yeah, thank you all very much for your time. I really appreciate that.
Next, if we could have Sandra up. Sorry, Sandra, I didn't see you sneak in. Sorry, I pushed Samuel ahead of you. You've got to come up the stairs. Yeah. And the share screen is down the bottom. It looks like a monitor.
Let's see.
Yep.
Okay. Can you see my screen and me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, no worries. Sorry, I dropped in late. Yeah, so thank you very much for organizing this, Adam, and I'm happy to present my research on romantic love, distraction, and task performance here. So we know that obsessions, intrusions, rumination, and worry are all unpleasant experiences. And in a previous study, I've shown that people who are in love think about their beloved about 65% of their waking hours, so that's quite obsessive. But I was wondering, is this unpleasant too, or do people actually enjoy that? So I wanted to know for this study if people enjoy thinking about their beloved. We also know that emotional information that is task irrelevant is distracting. And so I was wondering if thinking about the beloved is associated with self-reported trouble focusing on other tasks, such as work or homework. And then also if thinking about the beloved is associated with poor task performance as a sort of more objective measure. So the second research question deals with sort of subjective experience, and the third one with objective task performance. So we tested 100 participants, but 86 of them provided usable data, and all participants were in love. They were all young adults. They were mainly women. Most participants...
Sorry, Sandra, I'll just interrupt. I think we've got your notes screen instead of the actual slides.
Oh.
So getting the slides changing.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, sorry. Let's see. Screen share. Window.
I think it might give you a couple of options if you've got more than one monitor.
Well, I don't.
Okay.
So maybe if I do...
There we go, that's better. Now we're getting that.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, thanks for letting me know. So most participants had an opposite gender beloved, and then most of them were in a relationship. But of the participants that were in a relationship, most were not actually cohabitating or married, but some were. I asked them how much they had been in love for, and also
how long they had been in a relationship for, if any, and the mean was almost 3 years for both of those variables, but there was a wide range because some had only been in love or in a relationship for about a month, and the max was like 18 years. I had them complete a sustained attention response task, in which a number appeared on the screen between 0 and 9, and then they were instructed to press the space bar for any number except the number 3. So they shouldn't press when they saw a 3, but they should press for all the other numbers. This, in principle, is a very easy task because these numbers appear 2 seconds apart, so it's very slow. So in principle, very easy. But what makes it difficult is that the task is so easy that you start to mind wander. So this task is designed to be boring, basically, to make people start to think about other things. And then at random points in the task, we asked people, were you thinking about your beloved just for this probe? And they pressed yes or no. And we asked them, what are you thinking about right now? And they could just type a response, whatever they were thinking about. We also had them complete some questionnaires. So we asked them, how much of your time do you spend thinking about your beloved? And they used a slider to respond. The slider was not at all on the left and all the time on the right, so they could put the slider anywhere on that continuum. We asked them, how do you feel about thinking about your beloved? Ranging from it bothers me to I enjoy it. We asked, do you have trouble focusing on other tasks, such as school or work, because you are thinking about your beloved? And the slider ranged from not at all to all the time. We had them complete the infatuation and attachment scales, which is a questionnaire that I designed to distinctly measure infatuation level and attachment level, so to distinguish between the two. And when I say infatuation, that's basically a synonym for passionate love, which is that early stage love that is accompanied by butterflies in the stomach and euphoria and nervousness. And then attachment basically is companionate love, which is that much calmer state of bonding with another individual that develops over time. And then finally, we had them complete the depression and anxiety stress scales, and that was to control for any distraction due to depression, anxiety, and stress. So, the worrying and the rumination that I talked about in the very beginning. Okay, so the participants reported spending about 67% of their time thinking about the beloved. Now that's a lot. That correlated positively with infatuation level. So the more infatuated people were, the more time they spent thinking about their beloved. And there was no correlation with the attachment level. And while they were doing the task, they said yes 42% of the time to were you thinking about your beloved. So this was while they were actually trying to do another task. They were still thinking about their beloved about 42% of the time. And then the free responses were coded whether they were about the beloved or not, and they were coded as about the beloved for about 34% of the time. People really enjoy thinking about their beloved, so you see the distribution here. So this was the slider ranging from it bothers me to enjoy it. Then half of the participants moved the slider all the way to the right to indicate that they really enjoy thinking about their beloved. This was positively correlated with attachment level. So the more attached people were, the more they enjoyed thinking about their beloved. And there was no significant correlation with infatuation level, but if anything, it was negative. So the more infatuated they were, the less they enjoyed thinking about their beloved. Time thinking about the beloved was positively correlated with self-reported trouble focusing on other tasks. So the more time people said they were thinking about the beloved, the more they said they felt distracted by it. And this remained significant even when partialing out variation or variance caused by depression, anxiety, and stress. People can make omission errors on the task, which means that they forget to press the space bar in response to any number other than 3, but that type of mistakes was very low, so only in 0.6% of the time that happened. But commission errors were very high, and that means that they do press the space bar in response to 3, even though they're not supposed to. They're supposed to not press the space bar in response to 3. So that happened in about 26% of the trials, which is a lot. And that proportion commission errors was positively correlated with time thinking about the beloved. So the more someone said they thought about the beloved, the more often they pressed the space bar in response to 3, even though they shouldn't have. And this remained significant even when controlling for anxiety or depression, anxiety, and stress. And then that proportion commission errors was also correlated with trouble focusing because people are thinking about the beloved. So the more they said they had trouble focusing because they were thinking about the beloved, the more often they pressed the spacebar in response to 3. And again, that remains significant when controlling for depression, anxiety, and stress. So in this study, people reported spending about 67% of their time thinking about their beloved. And in my previous study, so this one, that was actually 65%. So those two results are very, very similar, which is extra interesting because that previous study was in Holland, so that was in a Dutch sample, and the current study was in the US, so that was an American sample. So that seems to be very similar between 2 different Western countries. This thinking about the beloved seemed related to infatuation and not to attachment. And even when people were actually trying to do another task, they were still thinking about their beloved about 42% of the time. So that's still a lot. However, even though it was, they did it a lot, people still really enjoy it. And that was related to attachment and not to infatuation, or if anything, negatively related to infatuation. And then time thinking about the beloved, self-reported distraction, and poorer task performance were all related to each other. So to conclude, thinking about the beloved is very frequent and a distraction from other tasks, but people find it pleasant anyway. So this, I think, is an important consequence of love in daily life. People may not be as focused on work or school, for example, as maybe they should be, but they don't seem to care. Now, their bosses or their teammates may do care, may not like this so much, but at least the person themselves doesn't seem to be bothered by it. Okay, so I want to thank the students in my Neurocognition of Emotion and Motivation lab, and thank you for your attention. And I wanted to highlight, I am the guest editor of a special issue called Neuroscience of Romantic Love of the journal Brain Sciences. The deadline for submission is November 1st. So please feel free to submit something. Let me know if you have any questions. There's a call for papers on the website. If you can't find it, just shoot me an email and I can send it to you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. Very interesting. It looks like Peter's got a question.
Yeah, hi, really interesting. Why do you think that frequency of intrusive thoughts about your beloved is not related to attachment?
Yeah, well, I think from from sort of personal experience, I think that thinking about the beloved, that obsession with the beloved, is really strong sort of in the early stages, which is usually the infatuation stage, and then sort of a decrease over time. Thank God, almost, right? So it's good that you don't keep doing that for the rest of your life. Whereas attachment usually grows over time, but it seems that if infatuation goes down, and infatuation may go up, attachment may go up, but then the thinking may also go down. And so there's one previous study by Arthur Aaron that has shown that there is a small but significant portion of people, I think like 10 or 20% of married couples, that say they are still infatuated even after, say, 20 years. But the thing that they seem to be missing is the obsessive thinking about the beloved. So that really seems to go down over time, even in people that say they are still highly infatuated with a long-term partner.
Yeah. Well, then it's also interesting that for the sort of later stage dyads or couples, the enjoyment of thinking goes up. And so it may be a part, early in the relationship, there's many intrusive thoughts, and later there's fewer, but you get more out of savoring those thoughts.
Yeah, and those early thoughts may also be more anxious, right?
Yeah,
so do they like me? Am I saying the right thing?
Yeah.
So the thoughts may be more negative.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's just because they're so frequent that they're more annoying. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Hi, that was a fantastic talk. And I was wondering if you could actually respond to some of Stephanie Casiopo's work, who's kind of looked at mapping out the brain in love and found that, correct me, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, but the angular gyrus might be heavily involved kind of in the process of romantic love, which seems to be linked to these sort of higher intellectual activities and cognition, and this idea that maybe there's sort of creativity that's boosted while someone is in love. So I was curious to know if you thought that you might see that participants actually might score higher on completing creative-based tasks while in love.
That's a very interesting thought. I remember reading a dissertation years ago that was about love and creativity. I don't know if that's been published by now. I also was not a student from my university. I think it was a student from France, so I'm not sure exactly who it was again. And I don't know if they published it, and I also don't remember the results. But so there's definitely some work going on about that. So that's a really good question. What I did find in one previous study was that the more attached someone was, the more they did post-error slowing. And post-error slowing is a cognitive control behavior that if you make an error and you notice, you're like, oops, I need to be more careful next time. And it's a very unpleasant feeling. But the more attached people were, the less post-error slowing they showed, which sort of indicated to us that if you are very attached to someone, that's very pleasant. It's also comforting, right? So you can make mistakes, but the other person, you're still attached to them and they probably love you back. And so that's fine, right? So it seems like that attachment sort of buffered against the unpleasant experience of making mistakes and then trying to do better next time. So I think that's the closest thing that I've done related to creativity. In terms of fMRI studies, I think we have a lot of passive viewing paradigms where we have people look at their beloved and then maybe a friend or a family member or a celebrity or something. And it's really difficult to know what the brain is doing during these passive viewing tasks. So then you get these blobs of activation, and then you need to rely on reverse inference to say, this brain region is more active when people look at their beloved. We know that this brain region is involved in XYZ, so that's probably what's happening when people are looking at their beloved. But of course, we don't really know because reverse inference has its issues. So what we should do instead, which is not necessarily easy, is make people do actual tasks in the scanner while that involves somehow pictures or other stimuli related to their beloved and maybe their friend or some other control stimulus, so that we know what the brain is doing because we have them do a particular task. So maybe a creativity task, and that would be very interesting to see if you're better at doing that when you look at the picture of your beloved than at a friend or something, because then it's more easy to interpret the activation patterns. Sorry, that's not a really good answer, but those are my thoughts.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, if there's no more questions, we'll move on to the next presenter. Thanks very much, Sandra. So the next presenter is Rose.
All right, I have never presented on Gather before, so please bear with me as I figure out how to actually show you my slides. And
Should be down the bottom. It looks like a monitor, a little circle.
Okay, I see. Okay, 1 second. Okay. Okay, give me 1 second. Hang on here. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, no presenter view, right? Just slides?
Correct, just slides.
Okay, amazing. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I am so delighted to be here today. Adam, thank you so much for organizing such a stellar and fascinating series of talks. I'm really excited to share my work with all of you today. Polyamorous love in the time of COVID-19, we'll be discussing the interplay between attachment, partner longing, and COVID distress. So I actually want to take everyone back to mid-March of 2020, and I really want you to take a moment and think about the emotions that might have surged through your body when you found out those lockdown orders were issued, right? How did you feel? And for a lot of us, the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic was marked by acute distress, loneliness, and uncertainty, as many of us were separated from our loved ones, our family, our romantic partners. Right? These are people who provide critical support to us, especially during times of great crisis. And so the story that I want to tell you all today is about a group of individuals who had a really unique experience during the pandemic. My data is grounded in the real and lived experiences of polyamorous individuals who are both simultaneously separated from partners and cohabitating with at least another partner while navigating the early days of the pandemic. So to actually take a step back and sort of orient you to what polyamory is, it's probably a term that you've heard tossed around before. Polyamory is a form of consensual, keyword consensual, non-monogamy in which all partners agree that they can engage in and maintain those multiple romantic relationships. Sometimes relationships are sexual, sometimes not. But the key thing to understand is that polyamory really places an important emphasis on cultivating those deep, intimate bonds with their partners. So we have a really foundational question in relationship science that we need to ask. Why should we study polyamory? Well, I would argue that relationship science is really heavily dominated, but also simultaneously hindered by these very mononormative and heteronormative frameworks. So my work aims to disrupt that. Polyamory is a really exciting sample to work with and community to work with because it enables us to draw some really salient micro and macro conclusions about how close relationships and attachment functions. So first of all, we have our little polyamorous network here, also called a polycule, right? And the polyamorous network is just a group of interconnected individuals who are all in polyamorous relationships with each other, and their partners' partners are also in the polycule. So we see that Emma is dating Lily, but Emma's not dating Soliloquy. So Emma's partner's partner is Soliloquy, also called the metamor, right? These are all the people that comprise that polycule. So if we're interested in studying sort of the microscopic sorts of behaviors and dynamics of polyamory, we might ask a really interesting question about, well, what do Emma's attachment bonds with Lily, Sherman, and Baxter actually tell us about how polyamory and attachment frameworks are operating in this kind of multi-partner relationship configuration? Is there sort of cross-pollination between all of these relationships? Is Emma's relationship with Sherman impacting her relationship with Lily? Or is Emma maybe cognitively organizing these relationships into discrete and disparate entities? And then for the macro conclusions and kind of questions that we can ask, we're really interested in tackling this core question that lies at the heart of relationship science. We really want to understand, well, how do we disentangle relationship-specific effects from individual differences in order to actually properly and accurately diagnose what is a relationship-specific effect and what is an individual difference? I would argue that you need comparative and multiple reference points to do that, which is why polyamory offers its really optimal, exciting window into that mystery. So we might ask as a micro question, well, is Soliloquy dispositionally anxiously attached, or is she only highly anxious with Baxter, but maybe more securely attached with Lily? Right? These are some of the really exciting questions that we can ask when we're working with a polyamorous sample. And so my research questions that I'm going to be discussing today, we have two for you. One is sort of what are the key predictors of COVID distress among this sort of unique sample of polyamorous individuals who are both separated from and cohabitating with partners during the early days of the pandemic? And then the second question that we're asking is, do we see really important, interesting differences emerge in how attachment bonds to separated versus those nesting partners, right, those partners that they're living with, are the differentially and uniquely impacting COVID distress? And when we're thinking about kind of an attachment framework, right, we might be conceptualizing those nesting partners as those who are acting as that safe haven or that anchor for those folks during times of stress in a way that those separated partners cannot. So again, polyamory is offering this really interesting window into how multiple attachments might operate during periods of global stress, which is an understudied topic. And so some of the key measures that we looked at today, I'll just sort of breeze through these, is missing partner, right? I wanted to be with my partner, right? I miss my partner. I thought about my partner. COVID distress, that's 2 items. This is different from scales that are actually measuring sort of clinical depression or anxiety. So I have become depressed because of the coronavirus. The coronavirus outbreak has impacted my psychological health negatively. And then, of course, the ECR short, right? That's the kind of attachment framework that we use to measure 2 different dimensions of attachment and security, which are attachment avoidance, right? There's that general discomfort with intimacy. I am nervous when my partner gets too close to me. And then attachment anxiety, right? That general kind of fear, that anxiety that your partner is inaccessible, that your partner is disengaged from you. I worry that my romantic partner doesn't care about me as much as I care about them. So what kind of methods did we actually utilize to tackle these questions? This entire data set was coordinated by Amy Moores, who is a champion and was able to expedite the IRB in the very early days of the pandemic. So it's a cross-sectional sample of individuals in a range of different relationships. The original N is 903, right? These are monogamous people, non-monogamous people, open people, swingers, polyamorous folks, and they were recruited through social media. And then the data was collected from March to May 2020. So this is the very early days of the pandemic. And we were really only interested in polyamorous folks who met very special criteria. So you see that the number was shaved from 900 all the way to 200. So they needed to have at least 2 partners, and they needed to have at least one partner they were separated with and one partner that they lived with. And then I'm also really excited to very quickly dive into the demographics today. What's really, really wonderful about working with polyamorous data sets is that this is a really rich sample of underrepresented voices in relationship science and sexology. Our data set is highly queer and gender diverse. 76% of people identify as part of the queer community, and about 15.6% identify as gender nonconforming. And then within sort of the larger kind of pool of folks in our sample, about 7% of them identify as trans, whether that's trans man, trans woman, or trans masc, gender fluid. So we have a diverse array of folks who participated in this experiment. Okay, so what did we actually find today? Our first question, of course, here is what is predicting COVID distress? So, yes, sorry, why is it? There we go. So, as expected, we see that missing a partner does, in fact, predict COVID distress along with anxiety to a separated partner. Oh, sorry, I don't know why it's not behaving. I don't know why it's not. You only see missing partner, everyone, right? I don't know why my slides aren't behaving and not. There we go. Sorry, technological difficulties. And we see, really interestingly, that when we're looking at avoidance to a nesting partner, right, that's actually predicting lower levels of COVID distress, which I'll talk more about in a second. And then, of course, like I said, anxiety to separated partner, we're seeing that that's predicting higher levels of COVID distress. And then avoidance to separated partner, we're not actually seeing any kind of significant effects there. And so the next linear regression that we ran 2. The first one was looking at this interaction between missing and attachment insecurity to nesting partners, but we didn't actually find a significant interaction. So when we ran this linear regression, and this is the data that I'm showing you now, does attachment to that separated partner predict COVID distress? This is where the story gets interesting and very nuanced. So we see that when we're actually looking at that interaction between missing and avoidance to a separated partner, there is a higher level of attachment avoidance that is linked to lower levels of missing, which then predicts lower levels of COVID distress. So it leads us to this really interesting question, because attachment theory generally conceptualizes attachment insecurity sometimes as maladaptive traits. But actually, when might attachment avoidance be adaptive? Well, many moons ago, when our prehistoric ancestors were living in that perilous savanna, and they were watching members of their tribe picked off one by one by a pack of ravenous lions, it may not have been so highly adaptive for them to form those close, secure bonds with others. It might have actually been more adaptive to develop almost a compulsive sense of self-reliance. So in some ways, perhaps the pandemic, at least the early days of the pandemic, right, it's creating this context in which those distancing strategies that are enacted by avoidant partners in this very stressful place might be linked to less COVID distress. Oh, I'm so sorry, my slides are not behaving at all. Oh, okay, so can you see my main takeaways, everyone? Is that good? Okay, so missing a partner predicts greater COVID distress. That's our first key takeaway. Our second key takeaway is that we know, as expected, anxiety to that separated partner predicts greater COVID distress. But what we did not hypothesize, what we did not expect would happen, is that attachment avoidance may actually serve serve as an adaptive function during periods of acute stress and partner separation, at least temporarily. Again, this isn't longitudinal data, but it's presenting an interesting narrative that might be suggesting there's actually an adaptive function for attachment and security. And then for our future directions, we're excited to test whether or not attachment might be linked to less anxiety, like clinical anxiety and depression during the pandemic, right? So if those who are scoring high in avoidance attachment might actually be reporting lower levels of anxiety and depression. And then we're interested in comparing attachment to nesting versus separating partners across non-monogamous subgroups. That might include swinging, open relationships. This is really fascinating because, like I said before, polyamory tends to sort of conceptualize those multi-partner frameworks as very grounded in those deep, intimate bonds, whereas other forms of non-monogamy may be sort of less focused on cultivating deep bonds and maybe more focused on casual sex opportunities or dyadic and group casual sex opportunities. And then finally, we're interested in exploring how pandemic behaviors, we have data on this, such as visiting partners during lockdown and violating quarantine orders, may predict COVID distress and other relationship-specific outcomes. Thank you all so much for listening to me. Thank you. A big thank you to Doctors Amy Moores and Paul Eastrick, neither of whom are here today, but shout out to you if you ever see this recording. And I really appreciate everyone showing up today. I'm happy to take your questions, your thoughts, your gripes, and you're always welcome to contact me. That is my email. I don't really have any social media, but please always feel free to email me. I'm always happy to chat.
Rose, that's really cutting edge stuff. Yeah, getting into a lot of nuances. Do we have any questions? It's like Peter's got a question.
Yes. Yes. It's a great question and something that I'm actually hopefully tackling in a big study that we're going to be launching, where we're actually collecting data on all members of a polycule so that we can have attachment at the trait level, like dispositional global attachment and relationship specific. What Amy did here is she only actually had them fill out measures for relationship specific attachment, but what we might do is compute a global kind of attachment, just sort of based on averaging all of the attachments of their partners. I think what I'll be able to do once I collect my data from my study is actually see if there's a correlation between like computing that global attachment and actually the global attachment that they're sort of self-reporting. So it's just really interesting to parse out all of these kinds of relationship specific traits from individual different traits. But that's the big question we want to answer. And I do not have that data as cleanly as I wish I had in this data set. But the answer is we probably are going to compute that global attachment score and sort of see how it factors into things.